you get a lightning strike, or you get somebody doing a gender reveal party and then set stuff on fire.
Yep.
Giant Leap with Taylor Wilson.
Welcome to Giant Leap. I'm your host, Taylor Wilson.
And I'm Joey Lovato.
And today we're talking about evolutionary biology.
Okay, so, going from a single-cell organism to where we are today, right? I think of the classic high school experiment that I did in high school where we had fruit flies and we bred them over the course of a few weeks. We followed these ones have white eyes and these ones have red eyes, and you can follow the recessive and dominant traits.
Yeah, following in the footsteps of the great geneticists and evolutionary biologists.
Charles Darwin.
Yeah. But I mean, that really is the exciting thing about evolutionary biology, and why it's something I personally love is that it is the story of us. It is the story of life on this planet, from that first proto, single cell to humans making podcasts.
the thing humans were bred to do.
The natural endpoint of evolution, clearly.
bred to do it. But going from that single cell to the blob, to a fish, to walking on land, to a monkey, to us, that picture, right, you see in your science classroom of the ape evolving, standing upright.
Which I think is a really misleading image, right?
Oh, okay, yeah, why?
I think, the story of evolutionary biology is so much more complicated and beautiful than that. It's not a linear straight line from those earliest single-cell organisms to humans today. It's a story of explosions, of contractions in biodiversity. It's the story of many false starts and, broken lineages. But at the end of the day, it's governed by kind of these interesting laws that have allowed life to explode and the kind of radiation that we see today around us.
Radiation, what do you mean by radiation?
Oh, not like nuclear radiation.
Okay,
We're talking about evolutionary radiation. And
radiating out from one point to...
Yeah, when we talk about radiation in biology, we talk about, what do you think? If you think of a species and the diversity that radiates around it, and you can have things like adaptive radiation where, think Darwin's finches. That's the prime example of evolutionary radiation, where you have some selective pressure in the environment, and that selective pressure breeds this kind of diversity, that what we call radiation, that radiating, tree of life around
not
an organism.
Nuclear radiation.
No, you're not going to get,
you're not going to get cancer from
Although
this.
we might talk about a little bit of radiation in this episode as well. Yeah, nuclear radiation.
Oh, hey, but that's not what this type of radiation. No. Darwin's radiation means to radiate from one point out in a lot of different areas to get to new species and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And we talk some other things. You talk about speciation and phenotypes, right? So that's like...
so we're talking about changes that happen among organisms that drive this kind of diversity. Phenotypes is important to understand because phenotypes are the observable qualities of an organism.
You have blue eyes, I have brown eyes.
Exactly. Shapes, the
You're
shape.
tall, I'm normal height.
Exactly.
Everybody.
So if you think of the genome as being kind of the instructions for life, what does it code for? Well, it codes for proteins, but in large number, the observable changes that it codes for is what we call phenotypes. So when we talk about that, we're talking about the kind of observable traits, behavior, structure, color, things like that.
To talk about all this, we talked to a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at Princeton, Shane Campbell-Staton, right?
Yeah, so Shane's a friend of mine and a really amazing evolutionary biologist who really studies kind of humans' impacts on all the other life on the planet. Maybe 50 or 100 years from now, how does life look different than it does today?
A lot of it depends on us, right? In terms of the decisions we make over the next 10 to 20 years is certainly going to be really important for determining, what biodiversity is going to look like. The thing about evolution is it's not a forward-looking process, right? It's not planning for anything. It's not trying to go anywhere specific. It's a reactive process, right? Like something happens, it has, whatever the population or species that you're looking at, they have whatever genetic tools, behavioral tools, epigenetic tools, in their toolkit. And, through the processes of, the interactions between ecology and evolution, right, you get to some outcome. And but it's an ongoing process, right? So, for instance, some of the work that we've done is looked at evolution in elephants, the evolution of tusk loss, which is typically a very rare trait in female elephants. During the Mozambican Civil War, there was large-scale ivory poaching, and the surviving females of the war, 50% of them, a little over 50%, were tuskless. Right? And so that's selection, right? There's like disproportionate advantage. And then when they had kids, a higher number of their daughters were born without tusks, right? And then that inheritance part is evolution, right? So literally a single generation. But without poaching, now all of a sudden it's moving back to its ancestral frequencies, becoming more and more rare. So evolution is reactive in that way. And a big part of what it looks like will depend on the decisions that we make. But one of the things that we do know is that it's going to be very different than anything we've ever seen on the planet before. We've reshuffled numerous species around the globe. If we take this thought experiment to the extreme, right, and say we just disappear, like we go and we all move to Mars or whatever it's going to be. What does life look like from this point moving forward? Well, we see a world that is by far dominated by domesticated species. So if you consider, for instance, land mammals, there are over 5,000 species of land mammals, but 96% of that biomass is us and the things that we have domesticated, right? The rest of those 5,000 species fit in that, less than 5%. All right. So you're looking at a world that's dominated by cats and dogs and cows and things like that. Even amongst birds, like 60% of all birds is either a chicken or a turkey.
Okay. Yeah.
It's going to be a really dominating force. And then now we have ecological interactions that have never occurred before. Species that have been evolving for tens, hundreds of millions of years in different places have been all of a sudden thrown into the mix together and are figuring out how to interact and are evolving and adapting to each other to create, new evolutionary trajectories that wouldn't be the case otherwise. And then, of course, there's all the stuff that, we would leave behind, right? All of, the pollution, whatever warming trends would still continue until they petered off. The fact that, the largest growing ecosystem on the planet at this moment is cities. All those are like really strange stressors, really strange habitats, things that are completely alien to most of the species on the planet.
You bring up an interesting point there. I think most people think, evolution happens over these very long, kind of almost like geological timescales. But what you're saying is that, some of these changes, these species level changes happen, I guess, in those terms, in a blink of an eye, in human timescales and generations. Are there, you mentioned the elephants, but are there other kind of like almost like sentinel species that you studied that are really adapting very quickly to humans and the environment?
Yeah, so I should say, when we talk about adaptation at this level, is what we call microevolution, right? So these microevolutionary processes, play out in populations, right? So it may not be an entire species unless that species is constrained to a very specific place and all under one pressure at a single time. We try to understand how humans drive the process of evolutionary change in other species. And we've done that in many different systems in a lot of different ways. We've studied the evolution of tusk loss in elephants. We've studied the evolution of these small lizards called anoles and their evolution and adaptation to urban environments. So on the island of Puerto Rico, these lizards have colonized multiple cities across the island. And these cities, obviously, they're very different structures, very different temperatures, what we call our urban heat island effect. And these lizards are much more heat tolerant, and they have longer limbs than their forest counterparts. And they've evolved this independently multiple times. We're studying birds that are, evolving to adapt to both being hit by cars during the nesting season and, more intense migration pressures, due to global climate change, and how they balance those two between a sort of anthropogenic rock and a hard place, so to speak. But even amongst my colleagues, I mean, there's many examples. Now, like, there's work being done in Darwin's finches, showing that, in urban areas, this process that we know about Darwin's finches, like the rapid radiation, it's all starting to break down in cities because, that radiation is driven in large part by seed size. But when everything's in a city eating Doritos, it doesn't matter that much, and things start interbreeding and collapsing again. There's a lot of things being done all over the place, and there's only more and more work to be done literally every day.
You said something interesting there when you were talking about the birds and the Doritos in the cities that I guess I hadn't really thought about before this point, but it really has to do with the speed of evolution, right? The fact that it's not static, that if you have a lot of pressures in the environment, it might really drive speciation or adaptation. And then if you kind of remove those pressures, maybe almost like it slows down. I mean, do you see examples of that, like in your work, where that kind of speed of evolution changes depending on the environment?
Yeah, so the thing about human-mediated pressures is that, for lack of a better word, they're violent, right?
Okay.
We don't do anything just a little bit.
Yeah.
When we do something, we do it a lot and we do it fast. And I think that's the thing, like some people argue, it's like, well, is that evolution or is that unnatural selection? Can we call that domestication, since we had a part in it? I consider it evolution in the same way that evolution plays out without us, except for the fact that those pressures have a tendency to be more intense and happen more quickly than many instances of natural selection, like many selective pressures in the environment. So you think about something adapting to temperature. It's like, well, from the Pleistocene till now, right, there's been sort of fluctuations and gradual rise in temperature that evolution has been reacting to and sort of chasing, along the way. And then all of a sudden you build a city and you have to deal with urban heat islands, and what used to happen over the course of centuries or, millennia are now happening over the course of, years or decades.
It's almost like the derivative, that rate of change is what's driving it more than the total change. I wonder, I wonder, are there like examples where you've seen just like really rapid changes that you don't think would have happened in kind of a natural setting that humans have driven, meaning like, changes that happened over 10 or 100 years or, a couple generations that would have taken thousands or tens of thousands of years from kind of natural forces? Or do you have any kind of examples of that?
There's work being done by my colleague Robin Tingatella at Denver University. And she studies Hawaiian field crickets. And, as most crickets do, there's, the males call to get, the attention of the females, and they come together and, do the thing that they do, and then to produce the next generation. But a few decades ago, there was an invasive fly, parasitic fly that was introduced to Hawaii that also hones in on those calls. So those males that are calling, they were more likely to get found by these parasitic flies, which then, they lay their eggs, and then the larvae kind of burrow into the cricket, and, you get this whole aliens situation happening. Well, over time, as she was doing this work, the crickets started to get more and more silent, when you went out into a field. And at first they thought, well, maybe they had just been extirpated because of the parasite. But going out and seeing it, like, there were still crickets, they just weren't calling. And they noticed that they found that basically there's a genetic change that affected the ridges on their back that they used to make the call. And basically this mutation messed up those ridges so that they didn't call anymore. Then a few years after that, she started hearing like this cat purring, and she's like, what is that? And it turned out to be the crickets, where they had now evolved a completely different call that sounded like a cat purring. Yeah. And the idea, like, I can't stress how phenomenal it is to be able to catch that sort of evolutionary change in real time, to go from having a call that that the species probably had for millions of years, to not having a call at all, to then evolving a completely different call. It's phenomenal. Her work is absolutely groundbreaking.
All driven by an invasive species that we, I guess, were responsible for introducing. That's interesting to think about. I think most people think about invasive species, or at least, so I grew up in the South, and we have kudzu that grows over all of the trees, and it's almost like it just blinks out the forest in kudzu. And that seems like a very obviously destructive force for a forest and biodiversity. But I guess what you're saying is that in some cases, invasive species can obviously be destructive, and they usually are, and overtake the biodiversity and stamp out certain species. But I guess the other part of that is that also drives change in the existing species in those environments, that it's not just, total destruction, that they as with all life on this planet, they have ways to adapt. I never really thought about that, but I'm sure that is an evolutionary pressure on the existing species.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. And because the thing is, like, species, the species that we're studying, right, they don't give a like, they don't, it's like, oh, you're invasive, and I'm native. Like, it doesn't matter to them. It's just whatever's in the environment. Yeah, we put these labels on things because they help us to sort of understand and model what's happening.
Are there things that we're learning through your research or others about the ways that organisms and species adapt to these pressures in their environment that, like, I don't know, we could learn from or make use of? Are there these kind of adaptations that end up being useful to humanity?
Evolution is sort of the fundamental principle that, governs all living things on this planet, and would govern all living things on any other planet, right? Because it's ultimately mathematical. But because of that, you take any aspect of biology, anything that requires biology, be it conservation, be it medicine, whatever it might be, evolution plays a fundamental role in a lot of those processes. There was at the turn of the last century, like the early 1900s, there's a zoophysiologist and Nobel laureate named August Crow. And, one of the things that, he famously said was that, for every, what he meant was medical problem, there will be some animal or group of animals on which it can be, best studied. And that recognizes the fact that evolution by natural selection has produced this incredible amount of biodiversity that have adapted to many extreme environments across the planet. And some of those adaptations either solve issues that we have as a species, in terms of like the human body, or they're very similar in some ways, but the species is able to persist despite it. And those species can be very surprising models for understanding aspects of human physiology and finding potential solutions for evolutionary medicine. So for instance, you consider things like like heart disease. You have, this hardening, of the heart, and, which builds up blood pressure and, results in a cardiac event, essentially, a heart attack. And, so if you have this question, it's like, okay, this thing happens, where do you go to find a model to understand like how we can get this thing to not happen anymore? Like, well, I guess you can try to design a mouse, but that's going to be an ambitious project unto itself, right? But it turns out in nature, it's like, well, theoretically, if you had a heart that had to, pump enough, it had to pump blood straight up against gravity 6 feet in the air, it's dealing with a lot of pressure as well, and that's what drafts have to deal with. And turns out that drafts are now an unconventional model for heart disease because of those adaptations. And we see that in many different species adapted to high altitude, species that are adapted to extremely dry, like desert type environments. They all have these specialized adaptations that are useful for us in many different ways.
And I guess that's just another reason that we need to do a better job of, protecting the biodiversity on this planet so that we still have those models and, things, laboratories to learn from. On this kind of spectrum from, organisms being very frail and imperiled to, able to adapt and very resilient, where do you kind of like chalk up life in kind of our modern world? Do you think it's very kind of frail, or do you think it's very adaptable and resilient?
Yes, is my
Fair
answer.
enough.
Because it is simultaneously both.
Yeah.
It's undeniable that we're dealing with species loss that far exceeds the background rate of species loss, and is only equivalent to basically the major mass extinction events, in the past. And that shows us like how fragile life can be. Some of these species we didn't even know existed in the first place, and they still went extinct, right? Before we could even find them, or understand what they were. So life is fragile, and if, for anybody who's done anything outside, it's like you go on a hike, sometimes you come back and you're glad that that you still have your life. Sometimes it can be rough out there. And life is very, very fragile, especially at the individual level. But also I've seen over and over again that, life is resistant and resilient. It comes up with all kinds of surprising ways to deal with all the stuff that we're throwing at the world right now. Now, is that something that can continue? Well, that's a dangerous game, right? Because the thing about selection is that it comes at a cost, right? And that cost is death. The stronger the selective force, the more individuals in a population or species have to die in order to get the remaining individuals to meet the challenge, right? And as I said before, so much of what we're doing is so extreme, that we're pushing species to the brink, and we're throwing a lot of different things at species at the same time, which means that, it could be a hurricane one day, but it might be pollution another week, or it could be global warming or urbanization, or an invasive species. But anytime a species adapts or responds to a selective event, right, it has to pay a cost in terms of genetic diversity, right? And again, it's not looking forward. It's not planning on anything. It's not holding anything back. It's like, oh, what if this other thing happens in the future? It's completely reactive. So, if you get an intense winter, and you get species, a population that adapts to be more cold tolerant in order to survive that winter, but then you get a massive heat wave in the summer. Well, some of that genetic variation, some of those individuals that would have been most heat tolerant, they may very well have died, the winter before because of that specific pressure.
And I guess that kind of speaks to, some of the extremes we see. I think people think of climate change as being one thing, but as the climate changes, you lead to these cycles of extremes. And I'm sure that's not, at least from a population level standpoint, healthy for some of these ecosystems.
It depends on the ecosystem. There are some, but I think the problem really comes when we get involved.
Yeah.
Right. So you think about like hurricanes, like across like the Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of those like marsh environments, they're designed to absorb massive amounts of water, right? And they naturally act as windbreaks. But you destroy most of that because you're digging for oil, and now all of a sudden it can't do the thing that it was supposed to do, but you also built a city right next to it. So now that city's underwater because you tore down the thing that would have protected it. You have these ecosystems that depend on fire, these like cyclical fires in order to reinvigorate. Some plants can only sprout, after major fire events, or can only set seed after major fire events, but you put people's houses in the mix, and then all of a sudden, like people, you don't want fires, but then all this stuff begins building up, like all this kindling begins building up. And then eventually, because the ecosystem does what the ecosystem does, you get a lightning strike, or you get somebody doing a gender reveal party and then set stuff on fire.
Yep.
And you get, and then that's the outcome.
Yeah.
So somewhere along the way in our own path, we've sort of disassociated ourselves from the ecology of our surroundings by creating a lot of this artificial environment. But we're still as likely as any other species, right, to go through the process of evolution because we are biological, and it's an inevitability.
I kind of wanted to segue a little bit to something here, which we've talked a little bit about, which is Chernobyl. I know you've done some field work and research there. I'm very interested in kind of radiation's impact on the environment, mainly from like almost like a molecular biology standpoint of how the injury actually happens and how that drives change, and what degree of the mistake, if you will, is driven by kind of things like ionizing radiation. But I think, thinking about like Chernobyl, such an interesting natural laboratory, right? Like the fact that, we just one day obviously released a lot of radiation to the environment and then just left, and let nature take its course.
It's been sort of a really interesting, unnatural experiment. Obviously, an extreme tragedy, one of the greatest in modern history. But what it left behind is something very fascinating in the sense that, humans left for very good reason. But then wildlife moved in, because of the absence of humans. Of course, now they have to deal with all of the radiation. But, at least from the looks of it, from what we understand, in the Chernobyl ecosystem, many species are doing incredibly well there. And like the wolves, for instance, in Chernobyl, they occur, I think, 6 times the density as they do outside of the exclusion zone, despite the fact that there is no physical barrier keeping them there. And wolf life is really hard. Like the most likely cause of death for a wolf is a wolf. Like they live rough. But they're, this particular population, and for many species, European boar, European bison, they're living in pretty large numbers. Like even like Przewalski's horses, like there are images of them like hanging out in the stables, in Chernobyl.
I was just thinking a little bit about how in the West, where I live, we're starting to reintroduce wolves. And that's, of course, a controversial topic, and it has unforeseen implications or foreseen implications. But is this something, you followed a little bit? And then if it is, are there interesting aspects, things that we didn't expect about this rewilding kind of process with bringing wolves back into these historical ranges?
The experiment in Yellowstone, I think, revealed a lot about the importance of having apex predators in an ecosystem, and, after the introduction of wolves in Yellowstone, you saw everything from the movement of prey species like deer and elk started to change, but then how the ecosystem was forming started to change. And then even how the rivers were flowing started to change, all because of the introduction of this one piece that had been missing, from this ecosystem. So predators, they're an integral part of every ecosystem, because they're sort of, they kind of manage everything from the top down. Yeah. But the thing is, for most of, especially here in North America, most of the apex predators are gone. We got rid of them, which means that, other species. So, for instance, white-tailed deer, they are everywhere, absolutely everywhere. I can't even imagine how many billions of dollars a year insurance companies have to give out because somebody hit a deer. But the reason for that is, there's nothing except us during hunting season, right? There's nothing that's keeping that population in check. So, in terms of what we know can happen, we know that they can have a really positive influence on natural ecosystems. The trouble comes in with what are the ecosystems? That you walk outside of the boundaries of Yellowstone, now all of a sudden you're dealing with ranch and farmland mostly. So it's not natural ecosystems. These are human made ecosystems, with a bunch of very tasty things that are not very smart and confined to a very small pen at night, and any predator, worth $1 would see that as an opportunity. But what that ends up, we have very little tolerance, for species when it comes to, and I think at this point, it's not really even our lives that we're concerned about. It's about money, right? It's like a wolf will take, a rancher could lose a dozen, maybe 2 dozen sheep, to a large wolf pack over. Yeah. And I think maybe that's probably a bit much, but, when I was in Yellowstone the summer before, 1/4 of the wolf population had been shot and killed because it moved beyond the boundaries of Yellowstone. So it's not an equal fight, right? People say don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Well, don't bring teeth and claws to a human fight, I guess. It is the equivalent.
Why evolutionary biology? What kind of got you interested in evolutionary biology in general? Is that something you always knew you wanted to do?
Yeah, actually, which is really weird, because I think when you ask most biologists how they got into the field, there's typically a story about, hiking in the woods or splashing around in a tide pool. I was a latchkey kid, raised in the hood in South Carolina. When I wasn't at school, I was at home taking care of my little sister. So I got exposed to the natural world through television. It was like PBS and, Steve Irwin and Jeff Corwin, all of those things that really got me fascinated by the natural world. And for whatever reason, it just stuck. And then I think slowly this intense fondness for animals, as I, move through, my studies, it kind of honed in around evolution, right? The idea of being able to tell the story of a species from its DNA, right? That to me is just like a very powerful concept, to think about, to be able to take the very basic building blocks of life and tell a story of history and of interaction. Is just really powerful. It's something that captivated me in college. Finding my way through academia was actually quite difficult, because I didn't have a lot of science or math training by the time I got to college. So actually I got, just completely steamrolled my first year in college. I think I finished my first semester with like a 0.65 GPA, and I worked really hard for that horrible grade. So it really took me a while.
As we're talking about all these places, Yellowstone, Chernobyl, I just wonder, do you have a favorite field site? Is there a favorite place you've gone to do research that you just kind of have fell in love with?
Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in my entire life. But it's also, it means a lot to me for many reasons. Like biologically, seeing African megafauna in their natural habitat, there's nothing like it. Like, I don't care how many zoos you've been to. I don't care how many times you've watched Planet Earth, like seeing it in front of you, as it's playing out, there's just nothing like it. But also Gorongosa, this is where we did our first elephant project, and it has a very specific history. And the elephants in Gorongosa are not very tolerant of people at all, because the females that survived the war, they're now the matriarchs of their respective herds, and they had very little tolerance for people because they lived through a time that saw 9 out of 10 of the members of their species eradicated, in a decade and a half. So there's a lot of trauma there that, my collaborators and the park are trying to, help mitigate. And I think that specific history is really, is really important to me, and being able to like tell part of that story is really important to me. It's also the first time I went to continental Africa was, for this trip. So for many, many reasons, it's like one of my favorite places.
What does kind of an average field season or research project look like? What are the kind of tools that you're using? Maybe take us through kind of a day in the life a little bit.
My lab is strange in that we work on so many different organisms in so many different places. So the field work will depend very much on what we're studying. So the work that we're doing with elephants, for instance, right now we're working in Addo Elephant National Park in South Africa. And that is, it has its own history. But basically, myself and my graduate student, when we go out, we are getting DNA samples from elephants. Now, for most of my career, I've worked on anoles, which are about that big. So getting a DNA sample from a lizard and getting a DNA sample from an elephant, very different processes. So when we were in Mozambique studying those elephants, they would tranquilize elephants and like fit them with collars so that they could track them. And then we would get blood sample while they were doing that. In Addo, we went out with biopsy darts, and we have like basically like a dart gun that shoots a biopsy dart, and it sort of hits and then bounces away and takes a little bit of tissue with it, and then you wait for the elephant to move off, and and then you get out the car with a armed guard with you, to go collect the sample. So that's pretty interesting, intense work. That's very specific. But when we're in Puerto Rico working with lizards, it's like we're walking around, cities with basically fishing poles with tiny little nooses on the end. And then, we're catching, lizards with these tiny little nooses. So very different scenario.
I mean, what fraction of your work is kind of phenotypic or behavioral, and then how much of it's actually kind of genetic, like actually doing genomic sequencing and things like that?
They all work together. So depending on what we do, the one thing that I found that has been really interesting is like how much I've had to learn, like over and over. Pretty much every new project, I have to learn a new subfield. I started off as a thermal biologist, working with reptiles, and those were my first sort of experiments with rapid evolution, like studied the polar vortex and, cold response in lizards in response to polar vortex, and then urban adaptation in lizards. But then, we moved on to, to elephants. And I was like, okay, now I need to understand elephant biology, elephant ecology. I have to understand tooth development, in general, which I knew nothing about. And each of these is an entire field, like subfield unto itself. And then, wolves came along and all of a sudden I had to understand cancer and the molecular biology behind it and the immune system, which is a whole different set of things. And every project that has come along now, with the alligators, it's like, the reproductive system, endocrine disrupting compounds, the effects of hormones, like that's yet a whole different thing. And I think for a lot of people that like drive them crazy, and I've had mentors, come to me and be like, listen, what you're doing is amazing, but we're a little bit worried about you because you're doing so much. Which is understandable. But I had like very extreme ADHD and like my mind jumps between things a lot and I don't always have a lot of control over it. So I've set up my lab in such a way that it optimizes the probability that when my brain does jump, it jumps to something else productive, and that works for me. And I love learning these new, as frustrating, as it can be, as exhausting as it can be, it's also fun. And I feel like I'm such a better biologist because of it.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is just like lighting up everything in my brain of the way I the things I like about science, interdisciplinary science, getting to kind of learn something new about a subfield every day. And it seems like the work you do in this kind of intersection of, evolution, evolutionary ecology, and human interactions, it seems very interdisciplinary, right? Like it seems like you're learning about, factors in the environment, climate, behavior, genomics. It's kind of this intersection of so many things. And to me, that's so fascinating because it combines so many different fields of science.
And it's expanding, it's like, even in terms of like urbanization, some of my colleagues are studying organisms, that, for instance, there's a graduate student, at Cornell who's been studying ants in cities and looking at thermal tolerance in these ants. And, when we've been looking at this like urban forest gradient, we sort of took a city as a city. But what she's done is she's gone into cities and looked at historical patterns of redlining, and she can map the thermal tolerance of ants against this map of redlining across a city, so now all of a sudden those biological issues become political and socioeconomic and racial issues as well. Right. So there was this, one of the fathers of like integrative biology, George Bartholomew, he said that at every level of biological organization, right, you can find interesting answers that will reveal themselves, but you only understand the significance by looking at the levels above, and you can only understand the mechanism by looking at the levels below. So it's by going up and down that cascade where you really get the true integrative story of what's happening. Now, typically, the top of that cascade is like ecology and then the environment. But now it's also politics and human history and racism and like all of these other sort of more abstract aspects of the world that we built have become very real, in terms of their empirical influences on living systems that live alongside us.
What kind of excites you most about your field and kind of research you're doing? Is there something that, if you look out, the next decade or two of your career that really excites you?
If you want to ask questions about what happens during the first steps of adaptation, right? Or the first steps of speciation, like what are the very first things that have to play out or sort out? That's a very difficult question to ask in most natural systems, but it's actually something very feasible to ask, if you're studying species that are going through that process or populations that are going through that process in real time. So I think, a lot of these systems, as sad as they are in like so many different ways, offer a really interesting opportunity to understand evolution in a way to a resolution that we haven't been able to in the past.
Are you an optimist about the biological world and its ability to kind of be resilient against change, or is it something that you really stay up at night worrying about our impact on the environment?
I do worry about our impact on the environment. I have no concerns that life will continue. I think the bigger question is, are we going to survive what we're doing to the planet? I think, life is going to continue. It made its way through 5 major mass extinctions. Of course, it came out the other side looking very different, and that is probably going to be the case, here as well. But life as a whole, I find it very hard to believe that it won't continue on after us.
Well, Taylor, like the Jurassic Park quote, life finds a way.
Sure does, Joey.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, that there will be animals and plants around in a million years, and we might not be. We might. Hopefully we will be, but it's possible we won't.
And if we are, we probably wouldn't even recognize those humans. If they're even Homo sapiens, they're probably going to be a different species by that point.
Dolphins or something, yeah.
Well, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, that there is something to be said about the resiliency of nature and the power of these kind of adaptive changes to overcome the harshest conditions imaginable. I mean, we live in Nevada. You've been out to the desert on a, 110 Fahrenheit day and understand how brutal nature can be. And the fact that life finds a way to exist in those conditions gives me a lot of hope for at least the future of life, if not certain species. And, as we talk about evolutionary biology and everything Shane talked about, it kind of harkens back, for those of you that have listened to the Ice Core episode, it does feel like some aspects of evolutionary biology and biology in general is a race against time. That just like these ice fields that, scientists are collecting ice cores from, we're constantly losing species, whether through, them speciating or just complete loss of ecosystems. And it's one thing when that happens naturally. I mean, we've seen great extinctions in Earth's history. And it's an entirely different thing when humans are the main driver of that. And so I think for evolutionary biologists to describe the plethora of life on this planet, and Shane brought this up, but there's an academic reason for doing this and trying to understand that thread of the history of life on this planet. But there are very practical reasons to do it. When species have to adapt to extreme conditions, nature finds the cleverest ways to deal with things like stress.
Oh, and I think so much of what I see in engineering is things we learn from nature, right?
Sure,
it's
bio-inspired
really cool.
engineering. But if you think more just kind of immediately, pharmaceutical development, so many of the drugs and medicines that we have today are if not inspired, directly derived from nature. We found a fungus that produces a certain small molecule. Maybe we find an alkaloid in a plant. Nature has found incredible ways to deal with what really is the hostility of nature. There's an academic reason to have this urgency to describe the life on this planet, but there's also a real practical reason that benefits us, which is, we could lose the species that holds the cures to
cancer or
other diseases, to overcoming things like antibiotic resistance, which is also an interesting facet of evolutionary biology.
Well, I know antibiotic resistance is a big deal because, we pump our cattle and our poultry full of antibiotics, and then these diseases come along, and we are increasing the way the rate at which they can adapt to antibiotics faster than we can develop antibiotics. And so we could face a really serious bird flu that could wipe out all chickens, or even worse, humanity, right?
Well, so viruses and bacteria are two different things, but in bacteria in particular, actually, poultry production is one of the large drivers of antibiotic resistance. Because historically we've used a lot of antibiotic, and if the selective pressure on that population is us, for example, dosing it with antibiotics, you can understand that it doesn't take very long to get these so-called superbugs, things like MRSA, that are resistant to the antibiotics we have today. So we have to find new antibiotics or new, antibacterial compounds, and then we can look back to evolution to find those. If we look in the natural world, it's very likely that the solution to things like antibiotic resistance are just waiting to be discovered in some tree of some branch of the tree of life, whether that's a microbe, a plant, an insect, an animal. These organisms have found incredible ways to adapt and handle the pressures of their environment.
Yeah, it makes me think of those extremophiles at the bottom of the ocean that don't need sunlight, but instead use the heat from below the earth to synthesize energy and instead of the sun. But it also makes me think about, we were talking about in this episode how quick evolution can happen, and I didn't realize that. Within a generation or so, we are seeing these kind of things happen.
Human beings have created new ecosystems, and think of these urban environments that you then put these animals into, and they have to adapt. And you see this incredible explosion of adaptation in these kind of environments. It's fascinating. It's also fascinating to think about the resiliency of ecosystems as they exist over time, and how humans can kind of destroy that resiliency. And Shane brought up a couple examples of that, coastal wetlands, and a good example that we have experience with, which is wildfire.
Yeah.
And wildfires are a part of the natural world and something that species on this planet have dealt with for millennia. And that can be a very constructive force for life. There are adaptations to wildfires that make them necessary for a lot of species. What humans have done, though, by suppressing wildfires, drying out forests, increasing the rains of things like bark beetles that have caused wildfires to get significantly more destructive. And that then is the tipping point, right? It's when you break an ecosystem enough, even if it is resilient, that ecosystem may not survive in the way that it had historically. So those are the things that concern me as humans change the environment, are we destroying the resiliency of these natural ecosystems?
Yeah, well, and also just made me think of one of your last questions that you asked, Shane, which was is life fragile or is it resilient?
Yeah.
And I loved his answer of yes, right?
Yeah, both,
at an individual level, yes, it's very, very fragile. And even maybe on a species level, it's fragile. But as a whole, it's just this mesh of just indestructible, force to keep living, no matter what it is. We may lose humans, we may lose bugs, we may lose some trees, but there will be something after.
Yeah. And, in the intro, we talked a little bit about how evolutionary biology is not a linear straight line thing.
Yeah.
And you look back in Earth's history in the geological or the paleontological record, and you see these mass extinctions, and then you see these explosions in life. And it's so fascinating to think of these like inflection points or pivot points that humans now may be responsible for the next one of those. And we may have an incredible influence on the future direction of life on this planet in much the same way that, in 65 million years ago, when an asteroid, we think, took out the dinosaurs, that laid the groundwork for the explosion that was the, era of the mammals. Mammals were not a big player in Earth's biome before the asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago.
Little did those dinosaurs know about podcasters in their future.
So it was only them getting wiped out that allowed podcasting to rise. So it is interesting to think about the changes that we'll have to the natural world. That's not to say it's something we should encourage and max create extinction because of the things we've said. I love our natural world. I love the beauty of our natural world. And even if you don't appreciate the beauty of the natural world as much as I do, or, as someone who is a conservationist, you can at least appreciate the fact that there are things in the natural world that are incredibly powerful tools to improve human lives. And if we lose that, that's going to be a real shame.
Yeah, we have talked about the practical, right, like reasons why we want to do this, but I do feel like there is just more broadly speaking, a responsibility that we need to take about the fact that we are like really impacting how the world is shaped and operates now. And, we should, I don't know, I think we should take some responsibility for that and just understand that, like, hey, we are impacting this a lot. We should also try and help, not because of anything other than the fact that it's what we're doing to the environment.
Yeah. And I think maybe it's just as simple as that is, there has never been a force in Earth's history quite like human beings. And I think our responsibility to protect our natural world really comes as a function of that impact that we have on the natural world. These things are not happening in the absence of humans. They're happening because of humans. And that, at least personally, instills me with a sense of responsibility that we do the kind of work that Shane does in studying these ecosystems, not only to classify and discover, the breadth of life on this planet, but truly understand where the weak points are, where the changes are happening, and the ways that, we might better live our lives such that, our natural world continues to be a thriving pool of biodiversity that, benefits us all.
So Taylor, to kind of like bring this home, right? We started with the non-linear nature of evolution. And that is something that I think we should think about too, right? It is not like one thing we do will kill all of the birds or anything. Everything is changing all the time in a lot of ways that we do and don't see. What does that look like, for the future of evolutionary biology?
And life on this planet. Yeah. And I think that is the key, is that the evolution of life is not a linear straight line process. It goes in fits and starts in lots of different directions. And the future of life on this planet is indeterminate. We don't know how life will evolve as we go forward. But I think one thing that we do know, and one thing that Shane's work has given us a good example of, is that we hold the keys in a lot of ways to the future of life on this planet. There's never been a species of life on this planet quite like humans. And it's, in large part, our decision what the future of life on this planet will look like.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful note to end on, Taylor. Thank you for chatting with me about this, and we wanted to thank Shane for talking to us today. If you want to learn more about Giant Leap, you can go to our website, giantleappodcast.org, or on any social media, as well as we have a Patreon if you'd like to support the show that way. Get some bloopers and outtakes and stuff cut from the show.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
From a single-celled organism to a fish to a monkey to us,
something like that,
podcasters here in the lab.
Sorry.
Watching Taylor just start to disassociate.
I was trying to say something really deep there, and just nothing was coming.
I watched you fully just like I watched your soul leave your body.
I couldn't find anything clever or deep to say. The plethora of life on this, plethora.
Okay.